Right now, the Disney company is incredibly interested in doing remake after remake of its animated classics. While this might have seemed like a novel idea at first, the sheer amount of these movies that they're putting out at once has become overwhelming. Not to mention that they rarely, if ever, live up to the originals. This is not that different from where we were in the 2000s. Instead of live-action remakes, we had direct-to-video sequels. It seemed that almost any movie could be a contender for a continuation. It didn't matter how many years had passed since the first movie came out, like Bambi, or even if the first movie had fallen into relative obscurity, like The Fox and the Hound. If they thought they could get some more money out of you, you were getting a sequel. This video is not about the reign of sequels from the 90s and 2000s. Rather, it's about the earlier days of the company when Walt Disney was still alive. Walt did not care for sequels to his animated features, and few, if any, were made in his lifetime. When it came to the movie's characters, you had the film, and that was it. This video is meant to explore the exceptions to the rule. We're going to be looking at the few true sequels made in Walt's lifetime, along with the further careers of certain lucky characters. To be clear, we're only counting film and television, not comics. A somewhat famous quote of Walt Disney is in regards to this phenomenon. "You can't beat pigs with pigs." I've also heard it quoted as, "You can't top pigs with pigs," but either way, it shows that Walt had this attitude starting very early in his career. 1933's The Three Little Pigs short was a major hit with audiences. Mickey Mouse was already a success story, and Minnie Mouse and Pete were closely tied to him, but here were four new characters, 3 pigs and a wolf, who really wowed everyone in the span of only 8 minutes. Since the cartoon did so well, it was natural to want to do a follow-up. 3 proper sequels followed. The Big Bad Wolf came next year in 1934, The Three Little Wolves in 1936, and The Practical Pig in 1939. I'm quite partial to The Three Little Wolves myself, but none of the shorts were as successful as the first one. It's not like they doubled down on the pigs that much. The cartoons were each spaced out by a year or two, but the final cartoon was the only one to feature a headshot for the pigs at the beginning. The other 3 were part of the Silly Symphony series. This implies that they had further pig cartoons in the pipeline that never came to be. Why didn't the pigs work as a series? Well, because they were never intended to be one in the first place. A character like Mickey or Oswald before him was designed to be flexible. You could put them in a number of settings. While quite a few early Mickey shorts took place on a farm, he could also show up in the Old West, the Yukon, medieval times, wherever the animators felt like putting him. The same went for his supporting cast. The Three Little Pigs was based on a very specific story. As such, they were sort of pigeonholed to this forest area. Even with added characters like Red Riding Hood and the Little Wolves, each short followed the same formula. Fifer and Fiddler Pig do something foolish, get menaced by the wolf, and have to get bailed out by their practical brother. While the pigs enjoyed a long, happy career in comic books operating under the same idea, they just never managed to make it work consistently on screen. They weren't the only Silly Symphony characters to get a sequel. This series was mostly made of one-shot cartoons, but occasionally some characters got a second go. First, there was the Seasons series. One of the earliest Silly Symphonies was Springtime in 1929. This was followed by Summer, Autumn, and Winter in 1930. Each short had unrelated characters, but they were cut from the same cloth. Santa's Workshop from 1932 had one of the most direct sequels the next year. The first cartoon shows Santa making last-minute preparations on Christmas Eve. 1933's The Night Before Christmas shows Santa on one of his many stops to deliver the presents. 1935 gave us 3 orphan kittens about a trio of kittens prone to mischief. The next year had a sequel, cleverly titled More Kittens, where the characters continued to get into trouble. Water Babies from 1935 was followed up by Mer Babies in 1938. Both shorts featured the adventures of little cherub-like beings in the water. The first one is on the surface of a pond, the second is in the ocean. A third entry, Snow Babies, was planned but never produced. 1935 seemed to be a good year for cartoons that got follow-ups. The Tortoise and the Hare was a whimsical, though largely conventional adaptation of the fable. In 1936, Toby Tortoise Returns presented audiences with a much wackier competition. This time, Toby and Max Hare are in a boxing match. Elmer Elephant and Little Hiawatha both had sequels planned, but neither was produced. The biggest star to emerge from the Silly Symphonies came from 1934's Wise Little Hen. Another fable adaptation, this story shows the Little Red Hen and her chicks trying to get help with planting and harvesting their corn. They ask Peter Pig and Donald Duck for help, but the lazy neighbors fake an illness as an excuse. Unless you've been living under a rock, you'll know that Donald Duck has become one of the most beloved cartoon characters out there, even surpassing Mickey at times. Seeing Donald as the instant star that he was, Disney did not try to make an actual sequel to The Wise Little Hen. Instead of retreading the plot like they did with The Little Pigs, they added Donald to the main cast of characters in Mickey's cartoons. This allowed Donald to have a number of varied adventures where he could develop his personality, including his famous temper. As interesting as that is, I have a feeling you're more interested in the animated films Walt made, not necessarily the silly symphonies. Well, some of them had their own follow-ups in Walt's lifetime, and others never got beyond the drawing board. The success and impact of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs cannot be overstated. Although technically not the first animated feature, this is the one that truly defined the medium and what these movies were capable of. It showed that cartoons could be more than characters just prancing around and singing for 8 minutes. In fairness, there's still plenty of that in the movie. The animators were expanding what they could do in these movies, but there are still quite a few scenes where they're clearly in their comfort zone. Not that these scenes aren't entertaining, but if there was too much of this in the movie, it could have lost some of its steam. In fact, it almost did. 2 entire sequences were partially animated and then cut for pacing reasons. A scene where the dwarves eat soup set to a bouncy song, and a scene where they all build a bed for Snow White. Demand was high for more dwarves after this movie. Walt was reluctant to reuse the characters, but evidently someone at the studio had a bright idea. They had quite a bit of unused footage that could work as a standalone short. Snow White Returns was a proposed idea to make use of these scenes. The dwarves would find out that Snow White is coming to visit and make her a bed as a present. After that, they would enjoy soup at their cottage. A bit of new material was intended to bookend and bridge these sequences, but nothing really came of the idea. The sketches were only rediscovered recently, and historians are unsure why it never happened. The dwarves would have 2 proper returns to animation in wartime shorts. 7 Wise Dwarves, made in 1941, was meant to promote buying Canadian war bonds. Most of this features reused animation, and appears to be done on the cheap. This is understandable given the situation. Other shorts like All Together and Thrifty Pig used the same tactics. Disney also produced a number of educational cartoons during World War II. Many of them are on the dry side, but 1943's The Winged Scourge really livened things up with 7 memorable characters. The first half is in line with the other educational shorts, warning about the dangers of mosquitoes spreading malaria. The second half shows the dwarves working to rid themselves of the insect, ensuring the audience's engagement. Walt Disney's second feature, Pinocchio, appears to be the one that got the most mileage out of his characters. Figaro and Cleo was a song that was written for the movie, but never used. It eventually became the focus of a 1943 short of the same name. In the movie, Figaro the kitten views Cleo the fish as a sibling, but the cartoon shows his instincts almost getting the best of him. That was about it for Cleo, but Figaro's career wasn't done. He actually had a short-lived series of cartoons he starred in during the 40s, where he was Minnie's pet. It's a little messed up that Minnie never had her own series, but her cat did. Jiminy Cricket arguably had the biggest career out of all the Pinocchio cast. He became something of a secondary spokesman for the Disney company, behind Walt himself. He played a decent role in Fun and Fancy Free, introducing the Bongo segment, and providing a bridge to the Mickey and the Beanstalk segment. He was almost the narrator of The Wind in the Willows, but they didn't go with that idea. Although he did not get any theatrical shorts like Figaro, Jiminy found a good home on television. He hosted a series of educational cartoons, and appeared in numerous episodes of the Mickey Mouse Club and Walt Disney Presents. Foulfellow and Gideon were not quite as lucky. Although they were planned to appear as a pair of swindlers in Mickey and the Beanstalk, they didn't make the cut. Fantasia was not meant to have a sequel exactly. Rather, Walt's plan was to reissue it every few years, with new segments being swapped in and out, along with old favorites, making it a fresh experience each time. Sadly, the public did not initially care for the movie, leading to the idea of a sequel or series to be shelved for a long time. Bambi is an unusual case. The novel it's based on had 2 sequels, Bambi's Children and Perry, the Youth of Squirrel. Bambi's Children was adapted as a comic, and Perry was produced as a live-action film, using nature footage to tell the story. Bambi himself even makes a cameo. One of the only true animated sequels by Walt Disney was The Three Caballeros from 1944. The movie is a direct follow-up to 1942's Saludos Amigos. Even then, both movies are slim on plots, if you can even call them that. They are essentially a series of shorts set in South America. These were made as part of the Good Neighbor policy, meant to strengthen the bond between the US and Latin America, and to prevent them from potentially being swayed by the Nazis. For propaganda, the movies are a lot of fun. Saludos ends with Donald Duck meeting Jose Carioca, a Brazilian parrot. The Three Caballeros has Jose return, along with Panchito Pistoles, a Mexican rooster. A third movie, Cuban Carnival was planned that would have had a fourth Caballero. Miguelito Maracas was a Cuban rooster, and there would have also been a love interest for the birds, Aurora the parrot. Presumably, she would have been voiced by Aurora Miranda, who had already appeared in Caballeros. Some segments, including a sequel to The Flying Gauchito, were storyboarded and partially animated. Only one of them was ever completed. Blame It on the Samba wound up being featured in Melody Time. Make Mine Music featured an animated version of Casey at the Bat, which ends on a famously sour note. In 1954's Casey Bats Again, he has 9 daughters. That's enough for a baseball team, and a chance to finally redeem himself in the eyes of Mudville. There are over 100 Uncle Remus stories out there, and Song of the South only adapted 3. Walt had planned to release a series of shorts based on some of the other adventures, but the movie was always viewed as at least somewhat controversial even upon its initial release. This may have deterred them from putting more money into making Brer Rabbit cartoons. Some of the ideas were released in storybook form in the following years. The last character who had a major career beyond their movie on our list is Tinker Bell. She acted as Walt's sidekick in the TV series, and quickly became just as synonymous with Disney as Mickey Mouse. Winnie the Pooh was something of the opposite of everything we've discussed. Walt had plans for a Pooh movie at some point, but wanted to make a series of shorts first to test the waters with audiences. The first short, Winnie the Pooh and the Honey Tree, was never meant to be a standalone. Instead, it served its purpose remarkably well, as Pooh is now one of Disney's most successful franchises. Walt Disney was less protective when it came to his live-action movies. Several of those would receive sequels in his lifetime, like The Misadventures of Merlin Jones and The Absent-Minded Professor. His Davy Crockett miniseries, later released as a movie in theaters, was such a hit that a second was quickly made. This was in spite of Crockett dying at the end of the first movie. Davy Crockett and the River Pirates was a prequel. Some of this could be because these live-action movies might not have meant as much to Walt. That's not to write them all off, and I'm sure he held some of them dearly. However, movies like Merlin Jones were quick, cheap, and easy. No one would worry about their integrity the same as they would for Snow White or Bambi. Although this video was meant to focus on what happened within Walt's lifetime, I think it's also worth discussing what led up to the eventual influx of sequels. After Walt died, no one really knew what to do next. It's rather telling that an early idea was to pitch a Jungle Book sequel. The Jungle Book had been a success, so a record album telling about Mowgli's further adventures was released a year later. They really did their best, getting Phil Harris and Louis Prima to reprise their roles, and having the Sherman Brothers write 2 new songs. The sales were disappointing, and a sequel was not made. At least not for quite a while. Although it still took some time for direct sequels to be produced, Disney would try to replicate some of their successful films in spirit. Bedknobs and Broomsticks follows most of the beats of Mary Poppins, including a lengthy animated section in the middle. David Tomlinson plays a major role again, and Julie Andrews was even considered for the lead. Similarly, The Aristocats has an original plot, but borrows several ideas from Lady and the Tramp. Later, Cruella de Vil was suggested as the main villain in The Rescuers, before being replaced by Madame Medusa. I have heard similar talk about Oliver and Company. I keep seeing people say that the little girl, Jenny, was originally intended to be Penny from The Rescuers. I can see where people could get that idea, but I haven't actually heard any official confirmation on this. Until I get an actual citation, I'm chalking this one up as a rumor. Fantasia had a sequel developed in the late 70s called Musicana, which sounded like it could have been really wonderful. Segments included the story of Ali Baba, acted out by birds, and an adaptation of The Emperor's Nightingale, featuring Mickey Mouse as one of the king's attendants. Higher-ups turned the project down, remembering that the first Fantasia had been a financial flop. Finally, Disney bit the bullet and released The Rescuers Down Under theatrically in 1990. The movie was not as successful as they had hoped. It was on video where sequels flourished. The Return of Jafar was meant to be 3 separate TV episodes to serve as a pilot movie to the Aladdin series. The show's writer, director, producer, Tad Stones, suggested it be released as a movie on video. Michael Eisner resisted, not wanting to cheapen the Disney brand, but eventually relented. I've often said that Jafar opened the floodgates, but I think it was the next Aladdin sequel, The King of Thieves, that really got the ball rolling. After that, there was at least 1 sequel released per year. Ariel's Beginning was the last one, released in 2008. While I can understand why Disney didn't want to make direct sequels to his animated movies, why didn't he try short features more often? Surely audiences would have loved seeing cartoons based around Scamp or Cinderella's mice. This is speculation, but I imagine part of it was the potential lack of quality. Walt Disney had his best men working on his features. The shorts did not always have the same amount of effort put into them, given the smaller budget and scale. That's not to say that the people cranking out the Goofy and Donald cartoons weren't skilled at what they did, but if you watch Bambi and then a Pluto short, you'll see the difference. The Winged Scourge featuring the dwarves actually had pros like Frank Thomas and Milt Kahl doing the animation, making it on par with the movies. Figaro, it seems, was easy enough to fake in his cartoons, but even Figaro and Cleo gets away with reusing some animation from Pinocchio. A lot of things can be said about Walt Disney. One thing I really admire about the man was his integrity and commitment to quality when it came to his movies. Would I have liked to see more shorts with the Seven Dwarfs? Certainly. But I respect Walt's efforts to make his animated films something special that really stood on their own. Perhaps the Seven Dwarfs are like the Three Little Pigs, and less is ultimately more.
Attaboy, Dopey, killer, good and dead.